lot of reviewers just compare the bodies. They don't actually look at the entire infrastructure, but we make a point of talking about how the lens and body work together because you can't use one without the other, right? Today, I want to just go over the most popular Sony versus Fuji APS-C lenses to find out which are just sharper. This is mostly to help us make broader recommendations for people looking for a first mirrorless camera, but I thought I'd share it in case you're interested in it too. I know it's a little nitpicky and a little pixel peepy. I'm not saying that this is all that matters in photography. I'm just saying this is one aspect of it. First up, the Sony 16-55 f2.8 at $1,400 versus the Fuji 16-55 f2.8 at $1,000. We have the Sony on the left and the Fuji on the right here. These are taken at 16 millimeters. Let's zoom in on our test scene. All these shots are done on a tripod in very carefully controlled conditions, very careful focus. I take multiple shots, refocusing. If you're watching in full 4K, it's 4 times. There is really no big difference between these two cameras. In fact, yeah, I would be happy with either one at this point. It's only when you really get to the corners that you start to see some difference. You can see on the left here, this moire and the graphic is bad, but it's an indicator of the lens sharpness. Like if you look at the numbers here, you can see near the corners at 16 millimeters, the new Sony lens is sharper. Makes sense, right? It's more expensive too. So let's look at it at 55 millimeters. In the center of the frame, I don't see a big difference. We see some processing artifacts, these little lines here. That's from Lightroom's handling of the Fuji files. I did use the Lightroom enhanced details options on these files. That's one of the drawbacks to the X-T3 is it uses the odd X-trans sensor arrangement instead of a standard bare filter, and things like fine lines, especially with colors like that, can get a little screwed up. Looking at bits of words like here and looking at the binding on this book, the Sony combination does seem sharper. Let's check how it does in the corner. So here again in the corner, the Sony lens seems sharper. So the more expensive lens wins, but they are both very good. Let's compare the standard kit lenses. The Sony lens is f3.5 to 5.6, while the Fuji is f2.8 to f4. That means the Fuji lens is almost a stop sharper. In low light, it's going to be gathering almost twice as much light and producing noticeably cleaner images. They're both image stabilized, so you should see roughly equivalent results there, but the Fuji lens is generally going to give you sharper results. You'll probably get these free with whatever new camera you buy, so the prices are a little bit irrelevant, but if you do buy them aftermarket, the Sony is quite a bit cheaper. At a glance with the wide shot, you don't see any difference, but if we really pixel peep and get in close at the long end of each lens, I don't know, they look pretty clear. The Fuji is a little bit longer, so it has an advantage there, but I'm also not seeing a huge amount more detail out of it. Let's check out the book bindings up here. Again, as we get closer to the edge, it seems like the Sony lens holds up quite a bit better. At 50 millimeters, I have to give a slight edge to the Sony kit lens. I won't bore you with the details, but I found them pretty similar at 16 millimeters. So again, while the Sony is a little bit sharper at the same f-stop, the Fuji can work better in low light. For me personally, while I found the Sony to be sharper, I would rather have the Fuji kit lens. I prefer that little bit of extra background blur and low light performance. Now let's compare what I think is the most important portrait lens, especially for this segment, which is the equivalent of a full frame 85 millimeter f1.8 or so. This is, in the Fuji world, the 56 millimeter f1.2. The closest I can come for price and performance in the Sony world is the Sony 55 millimeter f1.8. They're about the same price, but there's an important difference here. The Sony lens is designed for full frame cameras. This is a full frame lens. Sony does not make an APS-C portrait lens. They do have a faster lens. They have an f1.4 lens, but it's significantly more expensive, and that's why I chose to compare these two. I have shot a lot of portraits with the Fuji 56 millimeter f1.2, and it is an absolute star. But how does it compare against the Sony equivalent in case you're interested in taking some portraits? You can see with the wide shot, you wouldn't notice any difference, but let's zoom in to 4:1. Here we can see the Fuji on the right is significantly sharper than the Sony lens. Looking at the binding on the book, you can see far more detail in it. And even at the corners where the Sony has been winning, the Fuji still pulls it out. Now that's interesting because the Sony 55mm has long been considered a very sharp lens, and that has also been my experience. So how can the Fuji win? The Fuji lens is very good, but the most important factor is that the Fuji lens was designed for APS-C. You see, Sony makes both APS-C and full frame cameras, and they don't make as many APS-C lenses. So Sony APS-C users end up using a lot of full frame lenses, but their APS-C cameras will use less than half of the image circle coming from the back of the lens. And that means you're capturing less than half the detail. And I know anecdotally people feel like those full frame lenses are sharp on their APS-C bodies, but in the real world, you'll almost always get sharper results by using APS-C lenses on APS-C bodies. In this case, there is no equivalent for Sony, and that's too bad, which means for people who are looking for a headshot prime, a portrait prime, the Fuji system is the clear winner, and this is one that I personally use. Another key lens for both sports and portrait photographers is the sort of 70-200 telephoto zoom. A fast f2.8 zoom is really critical for freezing motion and in sports and blurring the background in portraits. Fuji, the closest they offer is the 50-140 f2.8 at $1,400. That's a really good price. In the Sony world, again, you have to step up to a full frame lens, a 70-200 f2.8. This is a great lens, but it's $2,600. And again, because it's full frame, you're using less than half the glass when you attach it to your APS-C body. But let's find out if you get what you pay for those $2,600. Zooming in, I really don't see anything to distinguish these two lenses at 70mm. Now, the focal range here is going to be key. The Fuji lens is wider than the Sony lens. If you want to shoot at 50mm, the Fuji is infinitely better. If you wanted to shoot at 200mm, you would have to crop the Fuji from 140mm, and then the Sony is almost certainly going to win. So where you're shooting really depends on your range. With an APS-C body, I tend to prefer the 50-140 focal length. With a full frame body, I definitely prefer the 70-200 focal length. If you're shooting sports with a Fuji, you might want a little extra reach. The X-T3, if that's what you're using, the Sport Finder mode adds a 1.3 times crop involuntarily. You don't have a choice. So I think in those cases, for something like soccer, a proper 70-200 range would actually be too long. Again, it kind of means the 50-140 with those Fuji cameras is the right focal length. Let's take a look at the sharpness at 140mm, the longest that these two lenses share. Zooming in and looking at the text, these look very similar to me. It's a tie. You can be very happy with either and know you're not missing out on anything important, except in the Sony world, you're spending an extra $1,200. The fact that Fuji has a lower cost option that doesn't have all that wasted glass is a real advantage. Now, it's an advantage to most, but if you're an APS-C user and you dream of upgrading to a full frame infrastructure and you want to buy some full frame lenses now and continue using them in the future, you can do that with Sony and you cannot do that with Fuji. Fuji only sells APS-C cameras now that use their X-mount lenses. If you think in the future you might want to spend more than $2,000 on a camera body, if your future hopes include really high budget stuff, the Sony world might be a better choice. If you're confident you're never going to want to spend that much money, the Fuji system is really a better value. Let's talk about the pricing of these two systems. Let's compare the Sony a6400 and the Fujifilm X-T3. These are very similar cameras, great focusing system. Neither has sensor stabilization. The a6400 with its kit lens is only $1,000 and the X-T3 is $1,700. So since they're so similar, it seems like the Sony is a good value. Of course, there's a lot that goes into this. The Fuji I find to be much more joyful to use. The Sony, on the other hand, is smaller and more compact and a very practical camera. The Fuji has 2 card slots. The Sony only has a single card slot. There's a lot that would go into this, and this comparison is more about the lenses than anything else. But here, on paper, the Sony seems like a much better value. What happens when you begin to add a couple of lenses to your collection? If you add just the lenses that we talked about today, which are really core, then you end up spending much more on the Sony system. You would end up spending $5,700 In the Fuji world, you would only spend $3,700. So in the Fuji world, your initial investment might be higher, but long-term, once you build out a reasonable collection of lenses, it can actually be far less expensive. Again, the underlying reason for this is that in the Sony world, you have to buy full-frame lenses for your APS-C bodies, and that's just a waste because you're not using all of it. In Fuji, they can charge less because they don't need to draw a big full-frame image circle that's not going to be used anyway. We will be releasing our full camera recommendations soon, along with detailed reviews, so be sure to subscribe to see that. If you have follow-up thoughts about the lenses specifically, I am happy to listen to them in the comments down below. Thanks a lot.